The grease was already popping when she reached for the flour. No measuring cup, no recipe card, just a hand that had done this 10,000 times. Everything she knew came from watching, and none of it was written down. Here are 30 oddly useful hillbilly cooking tricks that actually work. Saving bacon grease in a jar by the stove was the single most useful habit in any country kitchen, and the women who did it never thought of it as a trick. It was just how you cooked. Every morning after breakfast, the grease went through a small strainer into a tin can or mason jar that sat right next to the burners, warm and ready. That jar replaced butter for frying eggs, greasing cornbread pans, starting a roux, and softening vegetables before they hit the pot. During the Second World War, the government ran campaigns asking families to turn in their drippings. Rendered fat was used to manufacture glycerin for explosives. But in mountain kitchens, nobody needed a campaign. They had been saving every drop since before anyone could remember, because throwing away good grease was the same as throwing away money. Most kitchens today do not even own a grease jar. The trick did not disappear because it stopped working. Adding a pinch of salt to coffee grounds before brewing was something the old folks did without explaining why, and if you asked, they just said it tasted better. They were right. The sodium blocks bitter compounds on your tongue, smoothing out the harshness of cheap, over-roasted beans, the only kind most rural families could afford. A quarter teaspoon in the grounds before the water hit was all it took. Alton Brown brought this trick to television decades later and acted like it was a discovery, but women in Appalachian kitchens had been doing it since the early 1900s with the rough ground coffee they bought in bulk from the general store. You did not need to understand the chemistry. You just watched your grandmother add that tiny pinch without measuring, and you tasted the difference in the first cup. The coffee came out rounder, smoother, less like something you had to choke down. Nobody writes it on the bag. You either grew up knowing or you did not. Seasoning a cast iron skillet with nothing but lard and daily use was how every pan in those kitchens got its black glass smooth finish, and it took years, not hours. You rubbed the pan with lard or bacon grease after every washing, set it back on the warm stove to dry, and cooked in it again the next morning. The fat polymerized into a hard, slick coating that nothing stuck to, and every meal added another layer. Griswold and Wagner pans from the 1920s were cast thinner and machined smoother than anything made today, and the women who cooked on them built seasoning so deep you could fry an egg and slide it onto a plate without a spatula. People now buy pre-seasoned skillets and wonder why the eggs still stick. The answer is 60 years of daily use that nobody can rush. That pan worked because she used it every day of her life, and when she was gone, the seasoning held more of her than any photograph. Making buttermilk from scratch with a splash of vinegar and regular milk was one of the oldest substitutions in country baking, and it worked because the acid did exactly what real buttermilk does. It reacted with baking soda to produce the carbon dioxide that made biscuits rise and pancakes turn fluffy. 1 tablespoon of white vinegar stirred into a cup of whole milk, left to sit for 5 minutes until it thickened and curdled slightly, gave you something close enough that no one at the table could tell the difference. Before the 1920s, real buttermilk was the liquid left over from churning cream into butter, and every household that kept a cow had plenty. When families stopped churning, this trick kept the old recipes alive. You poured until the milk looked right, added the vinegar by feel, and moved on. It was just what you did when the recipe called for something you did not have and the nearest store was 20 miles of dirt road away. If saving grease was the first rule of those kitchens, preheating the cast iron skillet before pouring cornbread batter was the second, and breaking it meant soggy, pale bread that embarrassed whoever made it. You set the skillet in the oven while it heated, dropped a tablespoon of bacon grease into the hot pan, swirled it until the sides were coated, and poured in the batter fast. That searing contact between cold batter and screaming hot iron created the golden crust that crackled when you broke a piece off, the crust that separated real cornbread from the sweet, cakey version people in the mountains refused to eat. Appalachian cornbread had 3 rules: all cornmeal, buttermilk, and absolutely no sugar, and the hot skillet was the 4th. You learned it by hearing that hard sizzle when the batter hit the grease, and knowing the bread was going to be right. Using potato water as a base for bread dough and soups was a trick born from the simple refusal to waste anything, and the science behind it turned out to be remarkable. That starchy, cloudy liquid left over from boiling potatoes activated yeast faster than plain water, giving homemade bread a softer crumb and a longer shelf life. Pour it into a soup pot, and it thickened the broth naturally without needing a roux or a handful of flour stirred in at the end. Depression-era families figured this out by necessity. When you could barely afford the potatoes, you certainly were not pouring their cooking liquid down the drain. Grandmothers kept a pot on the back of the stove for exactly this purpose, ladling the water into jars to cool and use later. Bread made with potato water rose higher and stayed soft a full day longer, and the soups it went into had body and richness that people could not explain but could always taste. The water looked like nothing. It cooked like everything. Soaking wild game in buttermilk overnight was the hunter's trick that every mountain family knew and most modern cooks have never heard of. Venison, rabbit, squirrel, anything that came out of the woods with that sharp, iron-heavy flavor got dropped into a bowl of buttermilk and left in the cold overnight or sometimes 2 full days. The lactic acid broke down the tough muscle fibers gently without turning the meat to mush the way vinegar sometimes did, and the calcium triggered enzymes that softened the protein from the inside. What came out the next morning was tender, mild, and ready to flour and fry without any gamey bite. The old women never talked about enzymes. They said the buttermilk pulled the wild out of it, and that was explanation enough. You rinsed it, patted it dry, and seasoned it. Nobody at the table ever knew it had been running through the hollow 2 days before. Keeping a slice of bread in the brown sugar jar was one of those small kitchen tricks that sounded like nonsense until you tried it. Brown sugar hardens because the molasses coating on each crystal loses moisture to the air, and the crystals fuse together into a brick you cannot scoop. A slice of plain white bread tucked into the jar released just enough moisture to keep the molasses soft without making anything wet. You replaced the bread every week or so when it went stale, which meant it had done its job. Some families used a damp cloth instead, and others swore by marshmallows, but the bread trick was the cheapest and the most reliable. Nobody explained the science. You just saw your mother drop a heel of bread in the sugar, and 20 years later, you were doing the same thing in your own kitchen without thinking about it. Testing oil temperature with a pinch of flour was how every country cook knew the skillet was ready for frying, decades before anyone owned a kitchen thermometer. You dropped a small pinch into the hot grease and watched. If it sank and sat, the oil was too cold. If it sizzled gently and browned slow, you were close. If it hit the surface and immediately danced and popped and turned golden in seconds, the grease was right for chicken, fish, or fritters. Too much smoke meant you had gone too far and needed to pull the pan off the heat. Some cooks used a cube of bread instead. If it browned in 60 seconds, the oil was at around 365 degrees. The knowledge lived in the hands of women who stood over those skillets every evening. And when they stopped cooking, the next generation reached for a thermometer because nobody had taught them what the flour was for. Pinning a slice of bread to the cut side of a cake with toothpicks to keep it moist was the kind of trick that made you laugh until you tried it and watched it work. When you sliced into a cake and left the exposed crumb open to air, moisture evaporated fast and the edges turned dry and crumbly by the next morning. But a piece of white bread pressed flat against the cut surface with 2 toothpicks acted like a seal. The bread dried out instead of the cake, sacrificing itself so the good part stayed soft. You peeled the stale bread off the next day, and the cake underneath was as fresh as the hour it came out of the oven. This trick showed up at church socials and county fairs across Appalachia, wherever a woman needed a cake to last through a long afternoon of serving. It cost 1 slice of bread and solved a problem that aluminum foil and plastic wrap never quite fixed. Those kitchen tricks kept daily cooking smooth, but some of the old methods reached back centuries, to a time when survival depended on knowing what to do with dried corn and a pile of wood ash. Making lye from hardwood ash to turn corn into hominy was one of the oldest cooking techniques in North America, learned from the Cherokee and other indigenous peoples long before anyone called it nixtamalization. You packed clean ash into a wooden hopper, poured water through it, and collected the alkaline liquid that dripped out the bottom. Dried corn soaked in that lye water for a day or two until the hulls loosened and slipped off and the kernels swelled to twice their size. The process unlocked niacin that the body cannot absorb from untreated corn. Without it, families who lived on corn developed pellagra. The old cooks did not know the word. They knew that treated corn kept people well and untreated corn did not, and they passed the method along without ever needing a laboratory to prove what their hands already understood. Using a dusting of baking soda to tenderize cheap cuts of meat was a quiet kitchen secret that turned round steak and stew beef into something you could actually chew. The alkaline powder raised the pH on the meat's surface, preventing the proteins from bonding too tightly during cooking. The same science behind the Chinese technique called velveting, arrived at independently by rural cooks who had never heard the word. You rubbed 3/4 of a teaspoon onto a pound of sliced beef, let it sit 15 minutes, rinsed it, and patted it dry before seasoning. The difference was immediate. Meat that would have been chewy and gray came out tender and browned, with a texture that tasted like a better cut. Families who could not afford sirloin used this to make chuck and bottom round worth sitting down for. The soda cost almost nothing and worked every time. Stretching a pot of soup beans with pot liquor and cornbread was the arithmetic of survival in mountain kitchens. You had $1's worth of dried pintos, the broth they cooked down in, and a skillet of cornbread to soak it up, and somehow that fed 6 people until morning. Pot liquor was the cloudy, vitamin-rich liquid left after slow-cooking beans or greens with a ham hock or fatback, and nobody in those kitchens ever drained it off. You ladled it into bowls, crumbled the cornbread straight in, and ate it with a spoon. That broth held B vitamins, iron, and minerals leached from the beans during the long cook. In some Appalachian homes, pot liquor was given to sick kids before anything else because it went down easy and put strength back fast. The meal cost almost nothing. Nobody called it a recipe. It was just what you ate when that was all there was. Drying green beans on a string to make leather breeches for winter was a preservation trick older than any canning jar, and it required nothing but a needle, some heavy thread, and a dry place to hang them. You snapped the beans, ran a needle through the center of each one, and strung them like beads on a line that hung from the porch rafters or above the wood stove. They shrank and wrinkled and turned the color of old leather, which is how they got the name. When winter came and the garden was frozen under, you soaked a handful overnight, then cooked them long and slow with a piece of salt pork until they were tender and rich with a concentrated flavor that fresh beans never matched. The Cherokee taught early settlers this method, and Appalachian families kept it going for generations. You did not need a pressure canner or a freezer. You needed string, patience, and a grandmother who showed you how tight to pull the knot. If leather breeches showed you what patience could do to a green bean, the next trick showed you what a spoonful of mayonnaise could do to a cake. And the first time someone told you about it, you probably thought they were out of their mind. Adding 2 or 3 tablespoons of mayonnaise to chocolate cake batter was a Depression-era trick that produced the moistest, richest crumb you had ever tasted. And it worked because mayonnaise is just eggs, oil, and vinegar already combined. The extra fat kept the cake from drying out, the eggs added structure, and the vinegar reacted with the baking soda for a lighter rise. Hellmann's even printed the recipe on their jar labels starting in the 1930s, and church ladies across the rural South swore by it for decades. The trick faded when boxed cake mixes took over in the 1950s and 60s, but anyone who tasted the original knew the difference. Nobody could buy that texture in a box. She cut it off the cob with a sharp knife held at an angle, then scraped the back of the blade down each bare cob to get the milk out. That was the part most people skipped, and the part that made all the difference. Frying corn fresh off the cob in bacon grease was a late summer ritual in mountain kitchens, and it tasted nothing like boiled corn on the cob or anything from a can. The kernels hit the hot skillet and the natural sugars caramelized against the iron, while the starchy corn milk thickened into a creamy sauce that coated everything. Some cooks added a dusting of flour and a splash of milk to stretch it, turning it into what the old folks called cream corn, though it had nothing to do with the canned version. It was a dish that only existed for a few weeks every August when the field corn came in, and the women who made it right never did it the same way twice. They went by the look of the kernels and the sound of the skillet, and when they were gone, that particular August taste went with them. Before anyone owned a set of mixing bowls big enough to dredge a whole chicken, the paper bag was the tool, and it worked better than anything that replaced it. Shaking chicken in a brown paper bag of seasoned flour was how Sunday dinner got its coating in kitchens from West Virginia to East Tennessee, and the method was fast even and left almost no mess to clean up. You dumped a cup of flour, salt, black pepper, and maybe a pinch of paprika into the bag, dropped in 2 or 3 pieces at a time, folded the top shut, and shook hard until every surface was covered. The enclosed space created a cloud of flour inside the bag that reached every fold and crevice the way a shallow plate of flour never could. Kids fought over who got to do the shaking, and the sound of that bag rustling against the counter meant chicken was coming and everybody needed to wash their hands. The bags went into the trash and the chicken went into the grease, and that was Sunday. Dropping crushed eggshells into the coffee pot to settle the grounds was an old cowboy and farmhouse trick that sounds wrong until you understand the chemistry. The calcium carbonate in the shells is alkaline, and it neutralized the harsh acids in cheap, boiled coffee, while the jagged shell fragments attracted the loose grounds and pulled them to the bottom of the pot. What poured out was cleaner, smoother, and less bitter than coffee made without them. Trail cooks and camp cooks used this method for 100 years before percolators made it unnecessary, and farm kitchens held on even longer because the old enamel coffee pot on the back of the stove never went away. You saved your eggshells from breakfast, crushed them between your fingers, and tossed them in before the water boiled. The whole ritual, the cracking, the crushing, the waiting for the grounds to fall, was something you watched your grandfather do every single morning of your life. When he stopped making coffee, the kitchen never smelled the same again. Keeping a pot of beans simmering on the back of the wood stove all day was not a recipe. It was a way of life. The back of a wood-burning cook stove ran cooler than the front, somewhere around 200 degrees, and a heavy pot of Pintos or Great Northern set there in the morning would bubble low and slow for 8 or 10 hours without anyone tending it. You added water when the level dropped, tossed in a ham bone or a chunk of fatback, and by supper time the beans were so soft they fell apart on the spoon, and the broth was thick enough to hold a piece of cornbread upright. In homes heated by wood through the 1940s and into the 50s, that pot was always there, a background hum of food that meant someone was home, someone was keeping the fire, and supper was ready whenever you walked through the door. Electric ranges ended it. A burner that cycles on and off cannot hold beans at a low simmer for 10 hours the way a wood fire could. While the wood stove kept things slow, the ice bath did the opposite, and the women who understood both had total control over what came out of their kitchens. Blanching vegetables in boiling water for 60 seconds and then plunging them into a bowl of ice water was the trick that locked in color, snap, and flavor before canning or freezing. The quick boil killed the enzymes that caused vegetables to turn brown and mushy in storage, and the ice bath stopped the cooking dead so nothing went soft. Green beans stayed bright, corn held its sweetness, and okra kept its firmness instead of dissolving into slime. Extension agents from the USDA pushed this hard through the 1940s, printing it in every canning bulletin they mailed to rural households. The women who followed it put up jars that looked as good in February as the day they were packed. Curing pork with salt and smoke in a backyard smokehouse was the centerpiece of hog killing day, the single most important event on the farm calendar, usually falling in late November or December when the first hard frost made the air cold enough to keep the meat from spoiling while it was worked. You rubbed every cut with a mixture of salt, brown sugar, and sometimes black pepper, packed the pieces into a wooden box or barrel, and let them sit in the salt cure for weeks. Then the hams and shoulders went into the smokehouse, a small, dark building no bigger than an outhouse that every rural property had, and hung over a low hickory fire that burned day and night for days. The smoke sealed the surface, the salt drew out moisture, and the combination preserved the meat for months without any refrigeration at all. A family's smokehouse was as important as its well. When the last smokehouses came down in the 1960s and 70s, a whole way of feeding a family through winter came down with them. Rendering lard at hog killing time was a full-day job that turned raw back fat into the single most versatile ingredient in the country kitchen, and the smell of it cooking down filled the whole hollow. You cut the fat into small cubes, dropped them into a heavy pot over low heat, and stirred slowly for hours as the solid white chunks melted into clear golden liquid. When the bits of connective tissue floated to the top and turned brown and crispy, you skimmed them off. Those were cracklins, and the kids ate them hot, sprinkled with salt, before they even cooled. The liquid lard was strained through cheesecloth into crocks and tin buckets and stored in the root cellar, where it hardened white and lasted the entire year. It went into biscuit dough, pie crusts, fried chicken, cornbread, and even soap. One hog's worth of lard could carry a kitchen from December to October. Nothing from the store ever replaced what came out of that pot. Using vinegar and pie filling when the fruit ran out was the kind of trick that only makes sense when you understand how bare the pantry could get. Vinegar pie, sometimes called poor man's lemon pie, used apple cider vinegar, sugar, eggs, butter, and a little flour to create a custard filling that tasted tart and sweet and almost citrus, even though there was no fruit in it at all. The acid in the vinegar mimicked the sharpness of lemon juice, and the eggs set the custard smooth. Trail cooks on the frontier baked it because lemons would not survive the journey west, and Appalachian families kept making it straight through the Depression because vinegar cost pennies and lemons cost money nobody had. You poured it into a single crust, baked it until the top set with a slight wobble in the center, and served it to people who had no idea what they were eating until you told them. Most of them did not believe you. That was the whole point. Something made from almost nothing, tasting like something fine. Parching coffee beans in a cast-iron skillet over a wood fire was how mountain families roasted their own coffee long before anyone had heard of a French press or a pour-over. You bought green coffee beans in bulk. They were cheaper unroasted and kept longer in a cloth sack, and poured a single layer into a dry, heavy skillet set over medium heat. Then you stirred constantly with a wooden spoon for 20 to 30 minutes, never stopping, because the moment you walked away, the beans scorched and the batch was ruined. The kitchen filled with a smell so thick and warm it stayed in the walls. First crack came when the moisture escaped and the beans popped like quiet corn, and you pulled them off the heat when the color hit the shade of brown you wanted. The Foxfire books documented families in the southern Appalachian Mountains still parching coffee this way into the 1960s, and the ones who did it said store-roasted beans never tasted right after you had done it yourself. The skillet, the fire, the wooden spoon, every one of those tricks came down to the same thing in the end, which was knowing by feel what no instrument could tell you. Pressing a floured finger into bread dough to know if it had risen enough was one of the oldest tests in baking, and it could not be replaced by a timer or a thermometer or a recipe that said wait 90 minutes. You poked the dough gently, about half an inch deep, and watched. If it sprang back immediately, it needed more time. If it sprang back slowly and left a faint impression, it was ready. If the dent stayed and did not move at all, you had waited too long. That reading lived entirely in your fingertip, in the resistance of the gluten, the temperature of the surface, the slight tackiness that meant the yeast was still alive and working. No cookbook could teach it. You either stood next to someone who knew, or you never learned. Knowing the grease was hot enough just by listening was a skill that took years to build and seconds to use. The old cooks did not look at the oil. They listened. Cold grease was silent. Warm grease whispered. Hot grease crackled and popped with a sharp, steady rhythm that said, "Drop the chicken now." Too hot, and the sound turned angry, spitting hard with a hiss that meant the fat was breaking down and the food would burn before it cooked through. They could tell the difference between 350 degrees and 400 without ever glancing at a dial, because they had stood at that stove so many thousands of times that the sound was as readable as a familiar voice. It was knowledge built into the body, not the brain, something earned through 10,000 suppers and never written in a single cookbook. The woman who could read the grease never had to guess, and nobody who came after her could hear what she heard. Making biscuits with wood ash when the baking powder ran out was the kind of trick that separated the women who could feed a family from anything from the women who needed a grocery store. Before commercial leavening existed, cooks used a mixture of sifted hardwood ash and a splash of vinegar or soured milk to create the same chemical reaction. The alkaline ash met the acid and produced carbon dioxide, which lifted the dough. 4 teaspoons of fine white ash from hickory or oak, sifted through cloth to remove grit, stirred into 2 cups of flour with salt and lard, then mixed with sour milk and baked hot. The biscuits came out heavier than the modern kind, denser, with a faint mineral taste that people either loved or learned to love because there was nothing else. This method kept families in bread through winters when the general store was snowed shut and the pantry had nothing but flour, lard, and a fireplace full of ash. The recipe died with the women who carried it because the next generation never needed to learn. Using the color and smell of a dish as your only timer was not a shortcut. It was the original method, and it was more accurate than any clock. Those women knew cornbread was done when the edges pulled just slightly from the skillet and the top turned the color of a wheat field in September. They knew the beans were right when the kitchen smelled like ham and salt and the broth had gone from thin to heavy. They knew the pie was finished when the crust reached a shade of gold that no recipe could describe in words, darker than straw, lighter than honey, and glossy from the egg wash they brushed on by hand. Every dish had its own signal, and the women who cooked them every day read those signals the way a musician reads a room. They did not set a timer because they did not need one. Their whole body was a timer, eyes, nose, ears, all running at once. That kind of knowing takes a lifetime to build. It cannot be downloaded. Passing down a cast iron skillet seasoned by 4 generations of hands was never about the pan. It was about every meal those hands had ever cooked in it. A skillet used daily for 80 or 90 years held thousands of layers of polymerized fat, each one invisible, each one laid down by a different woman standing at a different stove in a different decade. Your great-grandmother fried eggs in it during the Depression. Your grandmother made cornbread in it while the boys were overseas. Your mother seared pork chops in it on a Tuesday night when she was too tired to think. The pan carried all of them. It weighed the same, but it held more. When someone handed you that skillet with the handle still warm, they were not giving you cookware. They were handing you the closest thing to proof that those kitchens existed, that those women were real, and that the food they made mattered. Nobody throws away a pan like that. Even the people who never cook keep it. Cooking without a recipe card and measuring nothing but by feel was the final trick. And it was really the only trick, because every other one on this list came from the same place. It came from standing in a kitchen so many mornings that your hands knew what a cup of flour looked like in the bowl without measuring it. It came from pouring buttermilk until the batter moved the way it was supposed to move, not the way a number told you it should. It came from cracking eggs one-handed into a skillet that was already the right temperature because you had been listening to the grease since before you picked up the first one. None of it was written down because none of it needed to be. The women who cooked this way did not follow instructions. They were the instructions. And when they left, when the last one who remembered how much salt goes in without thinking about it stopped standing at that stove, the recipe survived, but the feel did not. You can find every one of those recipes online. You will never find the hands. Smoking meat in the chimney was how mountain families preserved pork, game, and fish, using smoke from fires they were already burning for warmth and cooking. Hooks or racks installed inside chimneys held meat in the rising smoke stream, which dried and flavored the flesh while depositing preservative compounds that prevented spoilage. The technique required careful attention because too much heat cooked the meat while too little failed to preserve it, so families positioned racks at exactly the right height. Different woods produced different flavors, with hickory and apple being prized while pine was avoided for its resinous taste. The process took days or weeks depending on the size of cuts, with someone checking regularly to ensure even smoking. Meat preserved this way lasted through entire winters without refrigeration, providing essential protein. The chimney served double duty, heating the home while preparing food for storage throughout the winter months. Root cellar food storage represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about temperature, humidity, and air circulation that modern scientists now study with sophisticated instruments. Mountain families dug into hillsides, creating naturally climate-controlled spaces, maintaining temperatures between 32 and 40 degrees year-round. These underground chambers kept potatoes from sprouting, apples from softening, and root vegetables from desiccating through entire winters. Food preservation researchers now understand that consistent cool temperatures and high humidity slow respiration and prevent ethylene damage causing deterioration. The layering techniques, storing apples away from potatoes, wrapping vegetables in newspaper, layering carrots in damp sand, reflected understanding of food chemistry textbooks would later confirm. Families maintaining these cool caverns stored enough produce to survive months of isolation. Modern homesteaders now build root cellars using these principles. Vinegar copper cleaner transformed tarnished pots, pans, and hardware into gleaming surfaces using nothing but pantry vinegar and table salt. The method was simple enough that children could help with the task, mixing white vinegar with salt to create a paste that cut through oxidation and grime. Families would rub this mixture onto copper surfaces using old rags or their bare hands, watching dark tarnish dissolve away to reveal the warm orange metal underneath. The chemical reaction between acid and salt broke down the oxidized layer without scratching or damaging the copper beneath. Mountain households took pride in their copper cookware, often passed down through generations, and this cleaning method kept heirloom pieces functional and beautiful. The same mixture worked on brass door hardware, cabinet pulls, and decorative items throughout the home. No store-bought polish could match the effectiveness or the satisfaction of watching grime disappear. Storing eggs in water glass was the preservation method that kept mountain families supplied through winter months when hens stopped laying entirely and eggs became scarce. Water glass, a solution of sodium silicate and water, sealed eggshells by filling their tiny pores and preventing air and bacteria from entering. Fresh eggs were carefully lowered into crocks filled with the solution, where they remained edible for 6 months or longer without refrigeration. Families gathered eggs during peak laying season and preserved dozens at a time, ensuring protein through lean months. The technique required clean eggs with intact shells, so women handled each one carefully, rejecting any with cracks that might introduce contamination. Eggs preserved this way cooked normally, though they sometimes produced flatter whites, which mattered little when food security was the priority. The crocks were stored in cool cellars where temperatures stayed stable. Haybox cooking was the ingenious method where mountain women would bring a pot to boil, then nestle it inside boxes stuffed with hay, quilts, or sawdust, and let residual heat finish cooking over hours without additional fuel. Scientists studying thermal retention now recognize this as remarkably efficient energy technology that modern slow cookers replicate with electricity. The insulation held temperatures in safe cooking range while allowing tough cuts and dried beans to tenderize slowly. Families who couldn't afford constant wood or coal used this method to produce stews, porridges, and braised meats requiring hours of cooking. Modern engineers study these principles for off-grid cooking solutions. The technique also prevented nutrient loss occurring with prolonged high-heat cooking, preserving vitamins that would otherwise break down. Contemporary chefs now use similar techniques under fancy names like passive cooking. Flour paste wallpaper adhesive was homemade glue that hung wallpaper, sealed envelopes, and repaired torn books without requiring store-bought products. The recipe called for cooking flour and water together over low heat until the mixture thickened into smooth paste. The result was strong, flexible adhesive that dried clear and held paper firmly against surfaces. Families used this paste to decorate their homes with wallpaper scraps, catalog pages, or newspaper sheets, brightening otherwise plain wooden walls. The same paste sealed important letters, repaired children's school books, and attached labels to canning jars. Making paste became a household skill passed from mothers to daughters, with each family adjusting flour-to-water ratios based on experience. The paste cost virtually nothing and worked as well as commercial products for most paper applications. It represented self-sufficiency, proving that basic cooking skills could solve problems far beyond the kitchen. Soaking beans with baking soda was a trick that solved two problems at once in mountain kitchens where fuel was precious and time was always scarce for busy families. A pinch of baking soda added to soaking water softened dried beans faster by breaking down their tough outer skins, reducing cooking time by hours. For families burning wood, they had chopped themselves. Shorter cooking times meant real savings in labor and resources. The alkaline water also neutralized compounds that caused digestive discomfort, making beans easier on stomachs. Women learned exact amounts through trial and error, knowing too much soda left a soapy taste while too little made no difference. The beans soaked overnight in crocks near the warm stove, absorbing water and releasing starches. By morning, they were plump and ready, cooking to creamy softness in half the usual time. This knowledge passed quietly between neighbors as practical wisdom that made survival easier. Nixtamalization was the ancient process of soaking dried corn in wood ash lye water that Appalachian families learned from Cherokee neighbors and practiced for generations. The process involved mixing hardwood ashes with water to create an alkaline solution, then soaking dried corn kernels until the tough outer hulls loosened and slipped away. What seemed like primitive folk cooking was actually sophisticated chemistry that modern nutritionists now celebrate. The lye treatment released niacin otherwise locked inside the corn, preventing pellagra, a devastating disease that plagued communities eating untreated cornmeal. The alkaline bath also increased calcium and improved protein quality by making amino acids more bioavailable. Mountain families who continued this practice never suffered the nutritional deficiencies striking populations eating refined corn. Scientists now study this exact process, calling it one of the most important food innovations in human history. Those grandmothers stirring ash water were performing biochemistry. Butter wrapper greaser was a frugal technique that squeezed every bit of value from purchased butter by saving wrappers for greasing baking pans. Families carefully preserved the waxy paper wrappers after unwrapping butter sticks, folding them and storing them in kitchen drawers. When recipes called for greased pans, these saved wrappers provided enough residual butter to coat surfaces without using additional product. Children learned early to smooth wrappers flat rather than crumpling them, maximizing the usable surface area. The wrappers worked perfectly for cake pans, cookie sheets, and bread loaf tins, preventing sticking without any waste. Some families stored wrappers in the refrigerator to keep the butter residue fresh, while others kept them at room temperature for easier spreading. This simple habit saved measurable amounts of butter over time, stretching grocery budgets in households where every penny counted. Using vinegar to tenderize meat was how mountain families transformed tough cuts into something approaching luxury without spending money they did not have available. A few splashes of apple cider vinegar added to the marinade broke down tough muscle fibers in wild game and older livestock that would otherwise require hours of cooking. Families made their own vinegar from apple scraps, so the ingredient cost nothing beyond initial effort. The acid worked slowly overnight, penetrating deep into meat while adding subtle tanginess that complemented strong flavors of venison, squirrel, and tough old roosters. Women learned exact proportions through generations of practice, knowing how much was enough to tenderize without making meat mushy. The marinated meat could then be fried, roasted, or stewed with significantly shorter cooking times. This trick made poor cuts taste like quality and stretched limited protein into satisfying meals. Smoke preservation in small wooden smokehouses transformed fresh meat into shelf-stable protein lasting through seasons without refrigeration, using nothing but hardwood smoke and time. Food scientists understand that smoking deposits phenolic compounds, organic acids, and carbonyl compounds inhibiting bacterial growth while creating antioxidant protection. The slow, cold smoking techniques mountain families used, hanging hams and bacon for weeks in cool smoke, created preservation conditions that food safety research confirms prevent pathogen development. The specific woods chosen, hickory, apple, oak, Each contributed different antimicrobial compounds families discovered through generations of experience. Researchers now document that properly smoked meats remain safe for months at temperatures that would quickly spoil fresh meat. The smokehouses standing in every farmyard represented food security technology refined over centuries. Commercial processors now replicate these techniques but cannot fully match them. Egg carton. Fire starters turned kitchen waste into reliable kindling that could ignite reluctant firewood on cold mornings. Families saved cardboard egg cartons throughout the year, filling each cup with dryer lint, sawdust, or small wood shavings. Melted candle wax or bacon grease was poured over the mixture, creating compact fire-starting pods that burned hot and long enough to catch larger wood. Each carton yielded a dozen individual starters that could be stored indefinitely in dry locations. The hack solved the perpetual challenge of starting fires in wood stoves and fireplaces, especially during damp weather when kindling refused to catch. One pod placed beneath arranged firewood could have flames roaring within minutes, eliminating the frustration of failed fire attempts. Mountain families kept supplies of these starters ready throughout winter months, knowing reliable heat was essential to survival. Wrapping food in wet newspaper before burying it in coals was a technique that created steam cooking without any equipment at all beyond what most families had available. The dampened paper protected food from direct contact with ash, while moisture trapped inside created pressure that cooked fish and vegetables evenly throughout. Mountain families learned this from Native American traditions and adapted it to their own needs, using whatever paper was available from rare newspapers to catalog pages. The paper charred on the outside while food inside steamed to perfection, emerging clean and thoroughly cooked. Timing was crucial because too long meant paper burned through while too short left food underdone. Experienced cooks developed instinct for judging coals and thickness. The technique worked especially well for delicate fish that fell apart when fried, keeping flesh intact while infusing subtle smoke flavor. Children watched this magic happen at fish fries. Cast iron cooking was dismissed for decades as old-fashioned compared to modern non-stick surfaces, yet scientists now confirm what mountain cooks always knew. These heavy skillets delivered something essential beyond heat. Research proves that acidic foods cooked in cast iron absorb significant dietary iron, sometimes increasing iron content by 20 times or more. Appalachian women who simmered tomatoes, apples, and vinegar-based dishes in seasoned skillets were unknowingly treating iron deficiency anemia that plagued isolated communities. The pans themselves became supplements, leaching bioavailable iron into every pot of greens and every slow-simmered stew. Modern doctors now recommend cast iron cooking for pregnant women and children at risk of anemia. The seasoning process, coating pans with rendered lard and baking until glass smooth, created natural non-stick surfaces without synthetic chemicals researchers now question. Those heavy black skillets passed from mother to daughter carried more than recipes. Kerosene stain remover was a powerful cleaning solution that lifted grease, oil, and stubborn marks from fabric when commercial products were unavailable or unaffordable. Families kept kerosene on hand for lamps and heaters, discovering its secondary use as a remarkably effective degreaser. Small amounts dabbed onto stained fabric would dissolve grease and oil that water couldn't touch, lifting marks from work clothes and kitchen linens. The technique required careful application and thorough washing afterward to remove the kerosene smell, but the results justified the extra effort. Mechanics and farmers especially valued this hack, knowing their heavily soiled work clothes could be salvaged rather than discarded. Women shared the technique at quilting bees and church gatherings, spreading practical knowledge through community networks. The kerosene cost nothing extra since families already stocked it, making this hack purely about creative repurposing of existing resources. Cooking on the shovel blade was frontier ingenuity at its most practical when families lacked proper cookware or needed quick meals away from the kitchen hearth. A flat-bladed shovel, cleaned thoroughly and heated over open flames, became an instant griddle for frying eggs, toasting bread, or cooking small portions of meat. Field workers carried shovels anyway, making them dual-purpose tools that fed hungry workers during long days away from home. The metal heated evenly when held at the right angle over flames, and the long handle kept hands safe from the fire. Fathers showed sons how to judge temperature by watching metal change color and feeling heat radiating upward. Food cooked directly on the blade picked up a faint mineral taste that became associated with outdoor work and simple satisfaction. This technique required no additional equipment and worked anywhere a fire could be built, making it invaluable for remote work. Lacto-fermentation in stoneware crocks was how mountain families preserved vegetables through long winters without refrigeration, using salt, water, and time to transform cabbage into sauerkraut and cucumbers into pickles. Scientists now understand this process cultivates beneficial bacteria, lactobacillus strains that modern probiotic supplements attempt to replicate. The fermentation creates lactic acid, preserving food naturally while producing vitamins and compounds supporting gut health. Research confirms that traditional fermented vegetables contain bacterial diversity commercial probiotics cannot match. Mountain families who ate sauerkraut with every winter meal, who drank pickle brine for stomach troubles, were practicing preventive medicine. The cool root cellars where crocks sat bubbling provided perfect fermentation temperatures that modern enthusiasts carefully monitor with thermometers. What seemed like primitive preservation was actually sophisticated biotechnology. Potato rust remover was a surprisingly effective tool for restoring rusted cast iron, knife blades, and metal implements to working condition. The technique involved cutting a raw potato in half, dipping the cut surface into dish soap or salt, then using it to scrub rusted metal surfaces. The oxalic acid naturally present in potatoes reacted with iron oxide, loosening rust and allowing it to be wiped away easily. Families discovered this hack when polishing their precious cast iron skillets, the cornerstones of mountain cooking that needed regular maintenance to stay functional. The potato provided gentle abrasion without scratching seasoned surfaces, making it safer than steel wool or harsh chemicals that could damage the pan's coating. Children were often assigned this task, working through collections of rusty tools and kitchen implements on Saturday mornings. The method was slow but effective, requiring patience as the potato gradually broke down rust layer by layer. Saving bacon grease in tin cans was the foundation of mountain cooking economy, providing fat for frying, seasoning, and flavoring that cost nothing beyond the original bacon. Every time bacon was cooked, the rendered fat was carefully strained through cloth into cans kept beside the stove, building a supply that lasted between hog killings. The grease replaced expensive butter and lard for everyday cooking, adding smoky richness to everything from fried eggs to cornbread. Women knew exactly how much grease remained in their cans and rationed it carefully through lean months. The cans were never washed, building layers of seasoned flavor that improved with age and use. Children learned early that pouring grease down the drain was wasteful foolishness that would earn sharp correction. A full grease can represent security, proof that the family could cook proper meals regardless of cash on hand. This practice continued in mountain kitchens long after it disappeared from cities. Rendering lard at hog killing time was the process providing mountain families with cooking fat, skin moisturizer, soap ingredient, and medicinal base, all from portions modern processing discards. Scientists now recognize that properly rendered lard from pasture-raised pigs contains significant vitamin D, healthy monounsaturated fats similar to olive oil, and none of the trans fats in hydrogenated vegetable shortening. The rendering involved slowly cooking pork fat until it liquefied, then straining into crocks where it solidified into pure white cooking fat lasting months without refrigeration. Nutritionists who once condemned lard now acknowledge that traditional lard has a better fatty acid profile than many vegetable oils promoted as healthier. The cracklins left behind after rendering provided protein-rich snacks and additions to cornbread, stretching precious resources. Mountain cooks who saved every scrap of fat were practicing waste reduction that modern sustainability advocates now champion. Salt ice cream maker was a summer hack that turned hot afternoons into frozen treat celebrations without requiring expensive equipment or electricity. Families would nest a small metal can inside a larger bucket, filling the space between with crushed ice and rock salt. The salt lowered the freezing point of the ice, creating temperatures cold enough to freeze cream mixture placed in the inner can. Children took turns cranking or shaking the apparatus, watching through patient labor as liquid transformed into creamy dessert. The process took 30 minutes or more of continuous effort, but the anticipation made the rewards sweeter. Homemade ice cream tasted richer than store-bought versions, made with fresh cream, sugar, and whatever flavorings the family had available. Vanilla extract was common, but summer berries or peaches from the orchard made seasonal variations that became family traditions passed down through generations of hot weather gatherings. Making gravy from pan drippings was the technique that turned every meat dish into 2 meals and wasted nothing in kitchens where every calorie counted towards survival. After frying or roasting meat, the browned bits and rendered fat left in the pan became foundation for rich gravies that stretched protein into something more filling. Flour was sprinkled directly into hot fat and stirred constantly until it formed a paste that cooked to golden brown, developing deep, nutty flavors. Milk, water, or broth was added slowly while stirring to prevent lumps, creating smooth gravy that captured every bit of flavor from the original meat. Children learned to make gravy by standing beside mothers at the stove, learning exact motions and timing that defined good cooking. The gravy was poured over biscuits, potatoes, and cornbread, making small amounts of meat feed large families. Nothing was scraped into garbage when this knowledge lived in households. Sorghum syrup production turned tall grass into sweetener when refined sugar was expensive or unavailable, providing calories, minerals, and flavor that sustained mountain communities. Nutritionists confirm that sorghum syrup contains iron, potassium, and antioxidants that refined sugar entirely lacks, making it nutritionally superior to the processed sweetener that replaced it. The process involved crushing stalks, collecting juice, and slowly cooking it over wood fires until it thickened into dark, richly flavored syrup. Scientists studying traditional sweeteners note that sorghum's complex flavor compounds reduce the quantity needed for sweetness compared to refined sugar. The crop itself grew in poor soil and dry conditions where other crops failed, providing reliable harvest when foods were scarce. Mountain families who drizzled sorghum over biscuits were consuming functional food before that term existed. Modern producers now market sorghum as artisanal sweetener. Coffee grounds odor absorber eliminated refrigerator smells, neutralized garbage odors, and freshened musty closets using yesterday's breakfast waste. Families discovered that dried coffee grounds absorbed unpleasant odors as effectively as expensive baking soda, pulling smells from the air and trapping them permanently. Small dishes of grounds placed in refrigerators would eliminate the mingled food odors that accumulated over weeks. The same grounds sprinkled in garbage cans prevented the worst summer smells from overwhelming kitchens. Closets and storage areas benefited from sachets filled with dried grounds, keeping mustiness at bay in spaces with limited ventilation. The grounds could be refreshed periodically by drying new batches in the sun or oven, maintaining effectiveness indefinitely. This hack represented the mountain commitment to finding second uses for everything, transforming waste into household utility. Greasing cast iron with fatback was the secret behind every properly seasoned skillet in rural Appalachian kitchens across the mountain south. Fatback, the thick layer of fat from a hog's back, was rubbed across cast iron cookware while still warm, creating a protective coating that prevented rust and built the non-stick surface that made mountain cooking possible. Women saved every scrap specifically for this purpose, keeping pieces wrapped in cloth near the stove where they stayed soft and ready to use. The process was repeated after every use, building layers of seasoning that turned cheap cast iron into family heirlooms passed through generations. A well-seasoned skillet required no additional oil for frying and released food effortlessly. Children learned this ritual by watching mothers perform it hundreds of times before being trusted with precious cookware. This simple trick transformed basic equipment into tools that lasted lifetimes and cooked food with unmatched quality. Water glass egg preservation allowed families to store eggs for months without refrigeration by submerging them in sodium silicate solution that sealed the porous shells completely. This technique, passed through generations of mountain women, kept eggs fresh from spring laying season through winter scarcity when hens stopped producing. Modern food scientists confirm that water glass creates an airtight barrier preventing bacterial contamination and moisture loss while maintaining quality for 6 months or longer. The eggs emerged from their mineral bath looking identical to fresh ones, with yolks standing high and whites holding firm. Commercial facilities now use similar principles, but the chemistry remains what farm wives discovered through necessity. Families practicing this technique never faced winter without eggs for baking or breakfast. The method required no refrigeration, no special equipment beyond a crock, and no ongoing attention. Soap Sliver Ball was a thrifty bathroom hack that transformed unusable soap remnants into functional new bars through simple household chemistry. Families saved every soap sliver too small to use effectively, collecting them in jars or bowls until enough accumulated. The slivers were then moistened, pressed together firmly, and molded by hand into new bars that worked as well as fresh soap. Some families added hot water to soften the pieces before combining them, creating smoother finished products. Others grated the slivers and packed them into molds, producing bars with interesting marbled patterns. Children often helped with this project, enjoying the tactile satisfaction of squishing soap pieces together. The practice eliminated waste entirely, ensuring that every bit of purchased soap served its purpose. This hack represented the mountain philosophy that throwing away useful material was simply unacceptable when creativity could extend its life. Using coffee grounds for scrubbing pots was how mountain women kept cast iron and heavy cookware clean without wasting precious soap. The coarse texture of spent grounds provided gentle abrasion that lifted stuck-on food and grease without scratching seasoned surfaces that had taken years to build. Women collected grounds after brewing, keeping them in a tin near the wash basin where they stayed slightly damp and ready for use. The natural oils in coffee also helped condition cast iron while cleaning, maintaining the protective layer that prevented rust. This method cost nothing since the grounds would otherwise be discarded, embodying the waste-nothing philosophy that defined mountain households. Children learned to scrub pots this way before being trusted with more delicate dishes. The faint coffee smell that lingered on clean cookware became associated with spotless kitchens. This trick worked so well that many families never purchased commercial scouring products. Bread bag boot covers were improvised waterproofing that kept feet dry during wet weather when proper rain boots were unavailable or worn through. Families saved the plastic bags that store-bought bread came in, recognizing their potential as emergency foot protection. The bags were pulled over socks before feet went into shoes or boots, creating a moisture barrier that prevented water from reaching skin. Children walked to school through puddles and mud with dry feet, protected by nothing more than yesterday's bread wrapper. The bags were thin enough to fit inside regular footwear without discomfort, yet sturdy enough to survive a day's wear before tearing. Parents taught this trick to children as essential survival knowledge, understanding that wet feet in cold weather could lead to serious illness. The hack cost nothing and worked remarkably well, proving that protective gear didn't require store purchases. Keeping butter cool in the well was the refrigeration method mountain families relied on before electricity reached rural hollows. A covered crock or bucket containing butter was lowered on a rope into the family well, where water temperature stayed constant around 50 degrees year-round regardless of summer heat above ground. The butter remained firm and fresh for weeks without turning rancid, protected by both the cool temperature and the darkness that prevented light from breaking down the fats. Families designated specific depths for different foods, knowing exactly where to position the rope for optimal cooling. Children were often tasked with lowering and raising the butter crock, learning responsibility through this daily chore. The technique required watertight containers and careful handling to prevent contamination of the drinking water below. This simple system provided what modern refrigerators do today, using nothing but the Earth's natural temperature regulation and a bit of rope. Walnut shell dye created rich brown coloring for fabric, Easter eggs, and craft projects using nothing but discarded nut shells and water. Families collected black walnut shells throughout autumn, knowing the dark hulls contained powerful natural pigments. The shells were boiled in water for hours, producing a deep brown liquid that could permanently stain natural fibers and porous materials. Fabric soaked in the dye emerged transformed, colored in shades ranging from tan to nearly black, depending on concentration and soaking time. The same dye worked beautifully on Easter eggs, creating earthy tones that contrasted with commercial pastel colors. Children helped gather shells and watch the magic of color extraction, learning early that nature provided solutions for creative needs. The dye was color-fast and required no chemical mordants for cotton and wool, making it completely free and entirely natural. Cooking cornbread on a hoe blade was field cooking born from necessity when workers needed hot food far from any kitchen. The broad, flat blade of a garden hoe, scrubbed clean and heated over an open fire, became a makeshift griddle that cooked cornmeal batter into crusty cakes. Workers mixed batter in the morning and carried it to fields in covered pails, cooking fresh bread during midday breaks when hunger demanded more than cold biscuits. The technique gave hoe cakes their name, connecting the food directly to the tool and labor that defined rural life. The metal heated unevenly, requiring skill to rotate the blade and prevent burning while ensuring the center cooked through. The finished cakes had crispy edges and tender centers, tasting of smoke and honest work. This cooking method represented the ingenuity of people who refused to go hungry simply because proper equipment was unavailable. Those kitchens went quiet a long time ago. If one of these brought somebody back, leave a like and tell us which one.